The air in the back room of Clarice's Touch, a once thriving salon turned family relic, smelled faintly of old lavender oils and worn-out dreams. Isabella Monroe, now 27, wiped her hands clean of leftover soap suds after helping her mother close the rarely visited shop for the day. Her hair was tied in a messy bun, curls escaping rebelliously to kiss her cheeks, and her hands bore the dry, cracked texture of a woman who'd long shelved her own dreams to support her family. Her mother, Clarice Monroe, a widow who once built the most talked-about salon in Boston's Dorchester district, had become a quiet, fragile woman since her husband's death a decade ago. Clarice often sat at the window these days, lost in memories, humming old jazz melodies that once filled their living room with life. Isabella had always wanted more, not out of vanity, but out of hope. She used to dream of a beauty line that catered to women who looked like her mother, smelled like lemongrass, and had strength folded into every wrinkle. But every day, bills waited to be paid, and dreams took a back seat to reality. That evening, Isabella's life took a detour. She had been invited to a college networking gala at a downtown hotel through an alumni program. It was supposed to be a dull, polite event with canapes and stiff suits, but that's where she saw him. Daniel Everett. Tall, clean-shaven with sharp blue eyes that seemed to notice everything and everyone, Daniel wasn't just another face in the crowd, he was the crowd. He was the youngest VP at Everett Holdings, one of Manhattan's most influential real estate firms, and the son of billionaire Gerald Everett, who was rumored to own property from Fifth Avenue to Dubai. Their worlds couldn't have been more different, Isabella with her second-hand dress stitched by her mother, and Daniel with a silk tie worth more than her month's rent. Yet when she accidentally knocked over a glass of cranberry juice onto his blazer, her mortified apology sparked more than just a chuckle, it sparked curiosity. Their conversation flowed that night like two rivers that had always been meant to meet, and when she left, he asked for her number, despite the murmurs from those watching. Over the weeks that followed, Daniel and Isabella slipped into something dangerously close to love. He was enchanted by her depth, how she saw the world not through ambition but empathy. Her laugh wasn't forced, her opinions weren't filtered for effect, and she didn't fall at his feet like most women in his circle. She, in turn, was captivated by how he listened, how he never dismissed her small ideas, and how he made her feel like she mattered beyond appearances. He'd take her on late-night walks around Boston Harbor, surprising her with her favorite Thai food, and once drove 6 hours just to visit her when Clarice fell ill. Though their relationship raised eyebrows, especially from Daniel's cold and aristocratic mother Vivian Everett, who saw Isabella as charming but clearly temporary, he didn't care. Or so Isabella believed. When Daniel invited her to spend Christmas with his family at their winter estate in Vermont, she saw it as a sign that what they had was real. But while the fires inside the estate burned warmly, there were colder embers kindling beneath Vivian's poised smiles and Daniel's tightly clenched jaw. And as Isabella stood beside him in front of the roaring fireplace that snowy night, unaware of the calculated games playing behind silk curtains, she had no idea that her perfect fairy tale had already started to rot from the inside. Daniel Everett's childhood could be described in just 3 words: cold, structured, and pressurized. Raised in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, Daniel never once built a snowman or chased fireflies. His father, Gerald Everett, a steel-jawed real estate tycoon, believed children should be seen once a week and heard only when spoken to. Their mansion had more security cameras than family photos. His mother, Vivian, a porcelain-faced woman obsessed with appearances, dictated his life like a corporate schedule: piano lessons at 7 o'clock, etiquette at 8 o'clock, followed by business reading with his tutor. There were no late-night stories, no video games, and certainly no allowance unless you presented a detailed investment plan. The only real warmth Daniel ever remembered was from their longtime housekeeper, Miriam, who slipped him chocolate and whispered bedtime stories of simpler lives. In his teenage years, Daniel became obsessed with breaking out, not to rebel, but to escape suffocation. And when he got accepted into Columbia University, he chose to live in the smallest dorm with strangers just to breathe. His academic excellence made headlines, but it was his charm, quiet confidence paired with undeniable magnetism, that made him the most sought-after name at business networking events before he was even 23. When Isabella entered his world, she was the opposite of everything he knew, unfiltered, modest, and entirely uninterested in his money. She didn't ask what he drove or what properties he owned. She asked what made him smile. That night at the gala, he expected polite conversation, but instead, he got questions like, "What would you do if money didn't matter?" and "Do you ever just sit under the stars without a goal?" She wasn't there to impress, she was there to connect, and for the first time, Daniel felt like someone was truly looking into him, not at him. In the following weeks, he found himself skipping Friday meetings just to pick her up from work, walking her back home, and even helping her mother fix a leaky sink. He never told anyone, not even his closest business associates, how much joy it gave him to spend hours in her mother's outdated kitchen, learning how to make goat pepper soup and helping fold towels at the salon. Their lives were not synchronized by wealth or status, but by a growing rhythm that made Daniel feel human. But while love bloomed, so did Vivian's discontent. A woman who'd handpicked every associate, every charity dinner guest, and even Daniel's last 2 girlfriends, would not allow a salon girl from Dorchester to tarnish the Everett brand. She began making quiet moves in the shadows, reaching out to someone she believed could fix Daniel's romantic distraction before it spread into scandal. Their love story became one of whispered defiance and quiet rebellion. When Daniel proposed during a spontaneous trip to Paris, beneath twinkling lights by the Seine, ring bought from a street jeweler because Isabella didn't care for diamonds, he did so without permission, without announcement, and without the Everett family's knowledge. Isabella had hesitated, not because she didn't love him, but because deep inside, she feared she would always be seen as not enough by his world. But Daniel swore to her under that starlit sky that their love was stronger than bloodlines, deeper than legacy. For a while, it was. They returned to Boston, engaged and glowing, and began apartment hunting not in Manhattan, but in a brownstone she loved in Cambridge, somewhere between her old neighborhood and his corporate world. The media didn't know about their engagement yet, but whispers were brewing among Everett Holdings board members. Still, Daniel didn't care. He cut ties with shallow acquaintances, limited his visits to his parents, and began talking about setting up a community foundation with Isabella, something small, with real impact. For the first time in years, his life had purpose beyond profit. But they both failed to see the subtle manipulations forming behind the scenes, calls being made, files being drawn, introductions arranged. Because for Vivian Everett, love was a weakness. And she had no intention of letting it win. Their wedding wasn't the lavish spectacle most expected from an Everett heir, it was a modest yet heartfelt ceremony held in a rose garden on the outskirts of Boston. Only close friends and family attended, though the absence of Daniel's parents sent a clear message to everyone present. Clarice wept as she walked Isabella down the aisle, her daughter radiant in a simple ivory gown, her curls pinned delicately with her late father's cufflink turned into a brooch. Daniel looked both proud and nervous, unsure whether he had truly escaped the legacy he was born into or simply delayed its reckoning. Their vows were personal, raw, and emotional. Isabella promised love that didn't demand perfection, and Daniel swore to always choose her, even when the world expected otherwise. After the ceremony, they danced under strings of paper lanterns, kissed amid laughter, and toasted with apple cider instead of champagne. That night, in the small apartment they'd rented in Cambridge, they shared whispered dreams about children, building a life from scratch, and maybe opening a wellness center someday that would combine Clarice's old salon techniques with Daniel's business sense. For the first time, Isabella believed that fairy tales could be real, even if they looked nothing like the glossy ones on magazine covers. But the early months of their marriage weren't all golden evenings and long walks. Reality came fast and hard. Daniel's responsibilities at Everett Holdings tripled after his father pulled funding from 2 major international deals, blaming Daniel's domestic distractions. He now had to prove himself all over again, working longer hours and traveling more frequently, while Isabella stayed home tending to their rented apartment and caring for Clarice, whose health was beginning to falter. Despite the emotional distance beginning to stretch between them, Isabella refused to complain. She'd learned from her mother that love was more action than words, and she threw herself into building a warm, comforting home for Daniel. She found part-time work at a nearby organic skincare store, slowly experimenting with herbal blends from her childhood, secretly crafting what she hoped would one day become her brand. Meanwhile, Daniel, once so open and attentive, started missing meals, stopped returning texts, and grew more irritable, snapping at her for minor things like asking about his meetings or trying to join him at company galas. She excused it all as pressure, reminded herself that love was patient, and stayed silent even when loneliness started creeping in like cold drafts under the door. The real shift came subtly. At a corporate fundraiser hosted by M0THER Holdings, Isabella made her first appearance in weeks beside Daniel, wearing a navy blue dress she'd saved for months to buy. She smiled graciously at unfamiliar faces and tried to remember names Vivian had once criticized her for forgetting. But it was clear, she didn't belong. The wives of board members exchanged veiled glances and whispered behind fluted glasses, their manicured smiles never quite reaching their eyes. Isabella stood like a delicate brushstroke in a room full of marble statues. Daniel noticed, but he said nothing. That night, she asked him directly, "Do I embarrass you?" And though he denied it, the pause before his answer spoke louder than any words. Weeks later, the final blow came when Isabella received a call from Brielle, Daniel's cousin and one of the few people who had accepted her without judgment. Brielle, kind-hearted but observant, mentioned that Vivian had been introducing Daniel to a new assistant at the office functions, a woman named Vanessa Blake, described as poised, striking, and disturbingly ambitious. Isabella's heart didn't break immediately, it fractured, slowly and painfully. She didn't confront Daniel then. Instead, she waited, prayed, and convinced herself that her husband, her partner, would remember the vows they once whispered beneath paper lanterns. But deep down, an ache had begun, one that wouldn't be soothed with silence. Vanessa Blake walked into M0THER Holdings like a storm cloaked in silk. With piercing hazel eyes, impossibly smooth skin, and a voice that moved like honey but stung like whiskey, she was not just noticed, she was remembered. She had been personally recommended by Vivian M0THER under the guise of streamlining operations, but her real assignment was much more precise: dismantle Daniel's devotion to Isabella, brick by brick. Vanessa wasn't new to these games. She had a history of attaching herself to power, studying the emotional cracks in her targets, and inserting herself with surgical precision. Within 2 weeks of starting, she was no longer just Daniel's executive assistant, she was his confidant. She brought him protein shakes when he skipped meals, reminded him of meetings before his calendar did, and lingered a little too long when adjusting his tie. At first, Daniel was indifferent. He loved Isabella, or at least a version of her that once lit up his evenings. But Vanessa's charm was strategic, she didn't chase, she circled. She listened to Daniel vent about the pressures at home, about Clarice's growing health issues, about Isabella's emotional distance, never once mentioning that Daniel had become the one who created it. At home, Isabella felt the changes even before she had a name to assign them to. Daniel's phone was suddenly always face down. He began taking late calls in the kitchen and would silence his notifications with a guilty flick whenever she walked by. Their Friday game nights became Daniel's overtime catch-ups, and even the weekends were now booked with impromptu client meetings. Isabella's intuition screamed, but she buried it beneath the weight of hope. She'd spent her life watching her mother carry heartache with dignity, and she believed she could do the same. But the silence grew louder. One evening, she brought Daniel his favorite ginger tea as he worked in their living room. Instead of a thank you, he barely looked up. "I'm trying to concentrate," he muttered. When she softly asked about the gala she'd seen on a social media post, one he had told her was postponed, he snapped, "Must everything be about what you don't get invited to?" The words hung in the air, sharper than any slap. Isabella said nothing. She quietly walked to the bedroom, closed the door, and let silent tears soak the pillow that still smelled like him. Meanwhile, Vanessa's plan continued with venomous precision. She made herself indispensable in Daniel's world, first in scheduling, then in strategy, then in subtle emotional territory. She took note of the way his shoulders tensed when he spoke about his mother's disapproval, the way he craved validation, the way he felt emasculated whenever he was questioned. And she fed all those things back to him in doses that made her seem like the only one who understood. She never outright insulted Isabella, not at first. Instead, she planted seeds like, "You seem stressed. I hope everything's okay at home, or you deserve someone who supports your ambition without weighing you down." She would bring files to his apartment late at night under the excuse of emergencies and linger just long enough for questions to form but not long enough to be accused. Daniel started to enjoy her company, not because he wanted her, but because she was easy. Predictable. She didn't challenge him, didn't talk about their future, didn't bring up babies or doctor appointments. She was air-conditioned escape from the firestorm brewing at home. And though Daniel didn't know it yet, he was already cheating, not with his body, but with his emotional loyalty. And that, as Isabella would later learn, was betrayal in its purest form. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when Isabella sat in the cramped restroom of the organic skincare store, her trembling hands gripping the pregnancy test like it was a live wire. She had been feeling off for weeks, waves of nausea, tender breasts, fatigue that seemed to drain the life from her bones, but she chalked it all up to stress. Still, something deeper had stirred within her, something only a woman deeply attuned to her body would sense. And when those two pink lines appeared, clear and undeniable, her heart froze. For a moment, there was silence, pure and heavy, as if the world paused to let her absorb the revelation. She sat on the cold tile floor, test in one hand, the other wrapped protectively around her belly as tears welled up, not from fear, but from fierce, unrelenting love. She was going to be a mother. Despite all the emotional distance, the late nights, and Daniel's silence, this child was real, proof of something that once burned bright between them. This wasn't just hope, it was life. That evening, Isabella transformed their modest apartment into something warm and intimate. She laid out candles, cooked Daniel's favorite, rosemary chicken with mashed garlic potatoes, and placed a tiny note card next to his plate that read, "You're going to be a father." Her heart beat with cautious excitement, a mixture of fear and faith swirling within her. She imagined his face lighting up, the old Daniel breaking through the shell he'd become, maybe even wrapping her in his arms like he used to when they talked about their future kids. But hours passed. The food went cold. The candles died down to waxy puddles. Daniel never came home. He had told her earlier that he'd be out late finalizing an investor proposal, but Isabella had already started to suspect that investor was code for Vanessa. She tried to stay awake, kept checking her phone for a call or a message, but none came. When the clock ticked past midnight, she sat at the edge of their bed, her fingers resting gently over her belly, whispering, "I'll love you, even if you won't." It was her first conversation with the child. And it was more comforting than any she'd had with her husband in weeks. The next morning, Isabella woke to find Daniel in the kitchen, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. She hesitated before walking over, her heart pounding, still hoping the dinner setup from last night had spoken louder than words. But he didn't even mention it. With a shaky breath, she handed him the note card again. He read it, blinked, then looked up with a face void of warmth. "You're pregnant?" His tone was flat. She nodded slowly, her hands nervously intertwined. Daniel let out a short laugh, not of joy, but disbelief. "Is this some kind of joke, Isabella? You're telling me this now, after everything?" Her eyes widened. "What do you mean, after everything?" But Daniel didn't answer. He walked away, grabbing his keys, muttering, "I can't deal with this right now," before slamming the door behind him. Isabella stood frozen in the quiet of their apartment, her heart fractured, tears tracing silent paths down her face. The child she thought might pull them back together had only widened the canyon between them. She looked down at her belly again, placing both hands over it protectively, whispering more firmly this time, "Don't worry, my love. I've got you. Even if it's just me." And with that, her resolve began to quietly awaken. The days that followed were a haunting blur of cold silences and carefully calculated cruelties. Daniel became a stranger in their home, coming in late, leaving early, barely acknowledging Isabella's presence except to throw sharp questions or dismissive remarks her way. He no longer touched her, not even accidentally. He didn't ask about her doctor appointments, didn't comment on her fatigue, or the soft swell beginning to form beneath her clothes. And every time she tried to engage him, to ask what had changed, what she had done to deserve the emotional exile, he deflected with irritation. "You're being overly sensitive," he would say, "or it's not always about you, Isabella." But she knew something was wrong, something deeper than stress or work fatigue. He had become emotionally absent, yes, but now there was an edge to his absence, like he was hiding behind it. The man who once kissed her knuckles and whispered about future nursery themes had vanished. And each night he stayed out longer, each time he left his phone locked and turned away, Isabella's suspicions hardened into unspoken truths. Someone, had filled the space she once occupied. Her best friend, Melanie Clark, a brilliant and fiercely loyal marketing strategist, had just returned from a 3-month creative residency in Seattle. Melanie had always been Isabella's voice of clarity, her emotional compass, and the moment Isabella confessed her growing fears, Melanie didn't hesitate. "You need to know what you're dealing with," she said, her expression tight with concern. A few days later, Melanie invited Isabella to lunch at a cafe near Daniel's office. It was no coincidence. As they sat beside the window, sipping herbal teas, Melanie pointed discreetly across the street. There, standing too close to Daniel under the shadow of Everett Holdings, was a tall, striking woman with sleek auburn hair and stilettos that clicked like weapons. Vanessa Blake. She was laughing at something Daniel had said, her manicured hand resting briefly, too briefly to seem casual, on his arm. Isabella watched in stunned silence, her stomach churning. Daniel leaned closer, saying something, and Vanessa responded with a slow, knowing smile. It wasn't flirtation, it was possession. That's her, Melanie said quietly. I've been hearing whispers. She's been everywhere he's been for the last month. Isabella felt her world tilt. The betrayal wasn't just a suspicion anymore, it was painted clearly in the body language of two people who had rewritten her place in Daniel's life without so much as informing her. That evening, Isabella confronted Daniel, not with accusations, but with pain. "Who is Vanessa to you?" she asked quietly as he stepped into the apartment, coat still on. He froze, blinked, then smirked. "She's my assistant," he said too quickly. "Don't start with your paranoid theories." Isabella didn't raise her voice, didn't cry. Instead, she pulled out a crumpled tabloid Melanie had handed her earlier that afternoon, with a small column in the society section, Everett VP and striking new assistant spotted at the Four Seasons, strictly business or something more. She placed it on the counter like a silent piece of evidence. Daniel glanced at it, then scoffed. "You believe trash like that? Maybe you should focus on the baby and stop embarrassing yourself." The words hit harder than any slap. He walked into the bedroom and shut the door behind him, leaving her standing alone in the dimly lit kitchen, feeling like an unwelcome guest in her own home. That night, as she lay curled on the sofa, her back aching, her hands cradling her belly, she realized she wasn't just losing her husband, she was losing the fantasy she had clung to for far too long. But she wasn't ready to let go completely. Not yet. Somewhere deep inside, she still hoped that the man she fell in love with would wake up and fight for them. What she didn't know was that Vanessa was already working behind the scenes to make sure that never happened. The morning started like most others, gray skies, cold coffee, and silence that wrapped the apartment in a blanket of dread. Isabella stood at the bathroom mirror, brushing her hair with robotic motions, staring into eyes that no longer sparkled. Her once glowing complexion had dulled with stress, her posture bent under the invisible weight of loneliness and pregnancy. But today was different. Today, she had a sealed envelope in her handbag, a paternity test she had taken in secret, not because she doubted the child's origin, but because Daniel had planted the seed of mistrust so deeply, it began to suffocate her. After weeks of him suggesting she had planned the pregnancy, or worse, that it wasn't his, Isabella needed something solid, something indisputable to throw against his coldness. She had scheduled the test through a private clinic, keeping it from even Melanie. It wasn't about proving it to the world, it was about saving her own sanity. She hoped, naively perhaps, that presenting it to Daniel might thaw the ice that had frozen his heart. But as she placed the envelope beside his untouched breakfast and waited for him to emerge from the bedroom, her stomach clenched with uncertainty. When Daniel finally walked in, eyes glued to his phone, Isabella cleared her throat and gestured toward the envelope. "It's for you," she said, her voice barely audible. He glanced at it, then at her, then back at the envelope. "What is it?" he asked flatly. "The truth," she replied. Slowly, he peeled it open, his brow furrowing as he scanned the document. The results were clear, 99.9% probability, he was the biological father. But instead of relief, instead of remorse or even a flicker of emotion, he laughed. Not loudly, not mockingly, just a quiet, bitter laugh that made her heart sink further. "So you went behind my back to prove something that should have never been in question," he said, dropping the envelope on the counter like it was filth. "You think this fixes anything?" Isabella stepped forward, desperation trembling in her voice. "It's our child, Daniel. Our son. You can't keep pretending this doesn't matter." But he shook his head, already grabbing his jacket. "What matters," he said, pausing at the door, "is that I don't feel anything for you anymore." And with that, he left. No apology. No acknowledgement of the child growing inside her. Just silence and the echo of the door slamming shut behind him. That night, Isabella didn't cry. Not because she wasn't broken, but because she had no tears left to shed. She lay in bed, hands over her belly, whispering promises to the life inside her. You will be loved. You will never feel unwanted. But her voice trembled with doubt. How would she do it alone? Could she carry this weight without collapsing? As doubts clawed at her, she felt a soft flutter, a tiny movement, like butterfly wings brushing against her insides. It was the baby. A small, gentle reassurance that she wasn't alone. Her child was with her, alive, fighting to grow, to survive, to be born into a world that had already rejected him. She took a shaky breath and reached for her journal, something she hadn't touched in weeks. Page after page, she poured out the ache in her chest, the betrayals, the silence, the hope that refused to die. And as the night stretched on, she made herself a quiet vow: she would not be destroyed. Maybe Daniel didn't want this child. Maybe he didn't want her. But that child had chosen her to be its mother. And she would not fail him, not now, not ever. The Everett Holdings annual gala was the kind of event that glittered in headlines and drew society's sharpest eyes. Held in the grand ballroom of the Vanderhall Hotel, it was a sea of expensive gowns, murmuring elites, and camera flashes that caught only curated perfection. Isabella hadn't originally been invited. In fact, she hadn't even known the event was happening until Brielle, Daniel's cousin, forwarded her an e-invitation she accidentally received. It was addressed to Mr. Daniel Everett and guest. Not Mr. and Mrs., not even Isabella. Still, Isabella decided to go, perhaps out of hope, perhaps defiance. She wore the one black gown she'd kept from their engagement photo shoot, a dress that hugged her growing bump beautifully, paired with a simple choker her mother once wore in her own wedding. Her hands trembled as she stepped into the ballroom, but her spine remained straight. She had every right to be there. She was his wife. She was carrying his child. What she didn't know was that the night would not end with reconciliation or warmth, but with the cruelest unraveling of her heart before a room full of eyes. When she finally spotted Daniel, he wasn't alone. He stood by the champagne bar in a perfectly tailored navy tuxedo, smiling, genuinely smiling, as Vanessa Blake, in a dazzling emerald dress, leaned in to whisper something that made him chuckle. Isabella's breath caught. Her eyes locked on their posture, the intimacy in the way Vanessa's hand grazed his shoulder, the comfort in Daniel's lack of resistance. As if sensing her presence, Vanessa turned, her gaze slicing through the crowd like a blade. Their eyes met. For a moment, the room faded into a hush of painful stillness. Daniel noticed next. His expression twisted, not in joy or regret, but in thinly veiled irritation. "What are you doing here?" he asked when she approached, his tone hushed but laced with venom. "I'm your wife," she said softly, the words laced with disbelief. "I came to support you." Vanessa laughed gently beside him and sipped her champagne, making no effort to move or excuse herself. That's when Daniel raised his voice, loud enough for nearby heads to turn. "You shouldn't be here, Isabella. You keep pushing yourself into things that have nothing to do with you. This pregnancy, this drama, none of it belongs here." The sentence landed like a slap. Eyes turned. Gasps followed. And then came the moment that would forever brand her. Vanessa leaned in and whispered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Everyone knows he's not the father, darling. Stop embarrassing yourself." Isabella stood frozen, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might rip through her chest. Her hands instinctively moved to cradle her belly, not just in protection, but as if shielding her unborn child from the cruelty surrounding them. She looked around the room, the whispers, the judgmental stares, the poorly concealed smirks. Even people she had smiled at once now turned away, as if guilt by association could soil their gowns. Daniel didn't defend her. He didn't stop Vanessa. He didn't say a word. He simply took a sip of his drink and turned his back. That was the moment her illusion shattered. Not quietly, not in pieces, but like glass crushed under 1,000 feet. She walked out of the ballroom with her head held high, though tears stung her eyes and her vision blurred. The cold night air outside bit at her skin, but it was kinder than the people inside. As she stood under the glowing streetlight, her heels in hand, mascara streaking down her cheeks, she realized the truth: she was no longer trying to save her marriage. She was trying to survive it. And from that night on, something in her heart began to shift, not into hate, but into resolve. This wasn't the end. This would be the beginning of the woman she was meant to become. The silence in the hospital room was deafening, punctuated only by the faint beeping of monitors and the occasional muffled cry of a newborn in the ward beyond. Isabella lay motionless on the sterile white bed, her body aching and numb, yet her arms instinctively wrapped protectively around the tiny bundle resting against her chest. Baby Liam had come into the world with a soft cry and a full head of dark curls, his eyes the same haunting blue as Daniel's. But Daniel wasn't there. He hadn't answered her calls when labor began. Melanie had driven her through the pouring rain, gripping the wheel with one hand and Isabella's arm with the other as contraction after contraction racked her body. The birth was fast but brutal. And afterward, lying there exhausted and soaked in tears, Isabella clung to her baby boy as though he were the only oxygen she had left. The nurse had asked if she wanted to list a father on the birth certificate. Isabella had paused, staring at the empty line for what felt like hours before finally saying, "Leave it blank." It felt like a betrayal, but it was the only truth Daniel had given her. 2 days later, Daniel arrived. Not with flowers. Not with apology. But with Vanessa, again. He stepped into the room as if it were a business meeting, his eyes scanning the baby without expression. Vanessa stood beside him in a beige trench coat, arms folded, a smirk barely hidden behind her glossed lips. "Is this the child?" Daniel asked, like he was viewing a transaction. Isabella, still pale and weak, sat up and nodded slowly. "This is Liam. Your son." Daniel looked at the baby, then turned to Vanessa. "He doesn't look like me," he said flatly. Isabella felt as though the earth had tilted. "He's yours," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I had the test." "You know he is." Daniel scoffed and muttered, "I'm not taking responsibility for something I didn't ask for." Vanessa's laugh cut through the room like glass. "This is pathetic," she said, eyeing the small, sleeping infant. "Dragging him into this mess won't fix anything. You're nothing but a wreck clinging to a fantasy." Isabella clutched Liam tighter, heart hammering against her ribcage, her voice shaking. "Get out." But Daniel stood his ground. "You're not coming back home. I've changed the locks. There's no room for your drama in my life anymore." 3 hours later, Isabella was discharged from the hospital with nothing but a small suitcase and her son in her arms. Melanie helped her down the ramp, holding an umbrella over them as the cold wind whipped around them like judgment itself. Clarice had prepped the guest room at her small house in Dorchester, but Isabella still couldn't comprehend how her life had reduced to this, how the man who once said he'd die without her could now look her in the eyes and deny their child. As she stepped into the back seat of Melanie's car, her arms tightening around Liam, reality set in with suffocating clarity. There would be no more illusions. No more wondering if Daniel would change. No more waiting for an apology that would never come. Her marriage had died long before Liam's birth. This was simply the final blow. She watched the city lights blur through the rain-streaked window, her reflection staring back like a stranger. But amidst the grief, a strange flicker ignited, small, fragile, but persistent. It wasn't hope for Daniel. It was something else. A fire that whispered, "This is not your end." And for the first time since her world shattered, Isabella allowed herself to believe it. Clarice Monroe's home, though aged and modest, felt like a safe cocoon wrapped in the scent of old wood, thyme, and the faint aroma of peppermint tea. Isabella stood in the doorway of her childhood room, which now doubled as a nursery, staring at the peeling lavender wallpaper that once brought her comfort. A small crib, borrowed from a neighbor and lined with hand-sewn quilts, sat against the far wall. Liam slept soundly inside, blissfully unaware of the turmoil that followed his birth. Clarice watched her daughter from the hallway, her hands wringing the hem of her robe. She didn't speak much, but her eyes carried the weight of a mother who knew heartbreak intimately and wished she could shield her child from its claws. Isabella was trying, really trying, to be strong. But strength felt like an illusion when diapers ran low, formula was expensive, and job applications went unanswered. With her savings depleted, no spousal support, and no child care options, Isabella turned to the only work available: housecleaning, babysitting, and running errands for elderly neighbors. She carried Liam on her back wrapped in a faded shawl as she scrubbed floors in silence, wiping away the footprints of families that still had each other. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some women looked at her with pity, others with whispers. She was married to that Everett boy, right? I heard he threw her out the same day she gave birth. Shame. She was always the quiet type. But Isabella didn't have time for gossip. Her days began before dawn and ended after midnight. She cleaned bathrooms, folded laundry, washed dishes until her hands blistered, and still came home to rock Liam to sleep, sing him lullabies through tears, and write short notes in her journal she one day hoped to share with him. Every time her phone buzzed with a blocked number, her heart raced, hoping it was Daniel calling to say he'd changed his mind. But it never was. Sometimes she'd stand by the window at night, watching luxury cars pass by, wondering if Daniel and Vanessa were in one of them, laughing, whining and dining without a care. Her heart ached, but she pushed through. Because no matter how broken she felt, her son needed her to be whole. And that became her only mission, survive one day at a time, no matter how wrecked she was inside. Then one afternoon, as she walked past a high-end boutique downtown after finishing a long shift scrubbing marble tiles, a sleek black car pulled up beside her. Isabella turned instinctively, and there he was. Daniel. Dressed in a crisp gray suit, sunglasses pushed up on his head, the same arrogant smirk stretched across his face. Vanessa sat in the passenger seat, lips painted red like a warning sign, twirling her phone. Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since the hospital. Her faded clothes, her tired face, the baby strapped to her chest. Still playing the victim, he said through the window, his tone devoid of empathy. You should stop parading that baby around like a charity case. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. Before she could respond, Vanessa leaned out the window, laughing. She's just a wrecked, lonely single mother looking for pity. Let her enjoy the role. The car peeled off, laughter echoing behind them like sirens. Isabella stood frozen on the pavement, passers-by staring, her cheeks burning with shame. But as she looked down at Liam, wide-eyed and innocent, something cracked, not her spirit, but the shell that had encased her grief. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "They may see a wreck. But I see a reason." And in that moment, she decided, no more begging, no more humiliation. They had taken everything, except her will to rise. The small community center tucked between an old Baptist church and a thrift store became Isabella's unlikely refuge. Every Wednesday morning, she strapped Liam securely against her chest and walked 2 miles to attend a free therapy group for single mothers. The modest room had cracked floors, folding chairs, and cheap plastic flowers on the windowsill, but inside it brimmed with shared pain, quiet resilience, and the kind of warmth no mansion could ever offer. At first, Isabella didn't speak, she simply listened. To the woman whose husband abandoned her after she lost their second child. To the teenage girl raising twins alone after her family disowned her. To the immigrant mother struggling to find work while sleeping in shelters. Their stories didn't minimize Isabella's own suffering, they mirrored it, amplified it, and helped her realize she wasn't broken. Just bruised. Over time, she opened up. She spoke about Daniel, about the betrayal, the denial of her child, the public humiliation, and how she now cleaned toilets just to afford formula. Every time she spoke, her voice grew steadier. Every tear she shed carved space inside her for strength. And within that circle of broken women, Isabella began to feel whole. In the evenings, after Liam was asleep and Clarice was resting, Isabella began doing yoga stretches she remembered from an old YouTube channel she once loved. It wasn't graceful or perfect, her body still ached from labor, her muscles weak from exhaustion, but it felt sacred. Each breath, each pose, was a silent declaration, I am still here. She borrowed books on healing and self-discovery from the public library and devoured them like scripture. And through one of the counselors at the support group, she was introduced to Dr. Eliana Reese, a private therapist who took on Isabella's case pro bono. Dr. Reese was firm but gentle, and her sessions didn't focus just on the trauma, it focused on rediscovery. Who were you before Daniel? She once asked. The question stunned Isabella. She had lost so much of herself in the marriage that she had forgotten the girl who once mixed avocado oils and hibiscus leaves to make skin creams, the girl who helped her mother run Clarice's Touch, who dreamed of creating something beautiful, something hers. Slowly, she began writing those dreams again, this time not as fantasy, but as a plan. And with every journal entry, every sunrise yoga session, every circle of single mothers who cheered her small wins, Isabella found healing, not all at once, but in small, beautiful pieces. Inspired by the stories she'd heard and her own burning desire to reclaim her voice, Isabella started experimenting with skincare again in her mother's small kitchen. She borrowed ingredients from the grocery store where she occasionally helped stock shelves: lavender, shea butter, turmeric, tea tree oil, and returned to the recipes her mother once used in the salon. It was messy and imperfect. Some nights she spilled oils, others she fell asleep before completing batches, but something about mixing creams by hand brought her peace. She offered the first samples to her support group friends, who marveled at how soft their hands felt. "You could sell this," Angela, a young mom from the group, had said. "Seriously, Izzy. This is magic." Those words lit something in her. She didn't have capital, a brand, or even a logo, but she had something more important: purpose. Every cream she made, every oil she bottled, became a metaphor for her journey. Healing wasn't a straight path, it was messy, like melted wax and stubborn shea that took hours to mold. But just like her life, it could be transformed into something useful, even beautiful. And in the quiet of those long nights, as Liam slept nearby and Clarice hummed her old jazz tunes in the living room, Isabella felt the flicker of something she hadn't felt in months: hope. It was faint, still fragile, but undeniably alive. The walls of Daniel Everett's penthouse no longer felt like triumph. They felt like an echo chamber of a life he pretended to enjoy. The polished floors, the granite countertops, the breathtaking skyline view, none of it silenced the growing restlessness that followed him from room to room. Despite being promoted to executive director at Everett Holdings, he found himself increasingly detached from the success he once idolized. Vanessa was always around now, practically living with him, throwing lavish rooftop parties, shopping endlessly with his black card, and inserting herself into every aspect of his image. At first, her confidence and calculated charm had felt intoxicating. But lately, he caught her on the phone speaking in coded conversations, whispering in languages she hadn't mentioned she spoke, and brushing off questions with a kiss or a smirk. He tried convincing himself it was just his paranoia, a side effect of stress. Yet the feeling persisted. She now controlled his calendar, blocked certain messages, even dismissed his assistants on a whim. And worst of all, the hollow pangs of guilt about Liam, his son, kept resurfacing in the quietest moments, gnawing at the pieces of his soul he hadn't yet sold to pride. Vivian Everett, Daniel's mother, had become increasingly skeptical of Vanessa despite orchestrating their initial introduction. When Daniel brought Vanessa to a formal Everett family charity dinner, Vivian noticed her flaunting attitude and loud designer choices: too much cleavage, too much perfume, too many careless remarks about lesser people. She watched Vanessa flirt with one of Gerald Everett's longtime business partners and belittle the waitstaff, and for the first time, Vivian saw not an elegant solution, but a social liability. She pulled Daniel aside the next day and asked pointedly, "Do you really think someone like that will elevate your life? Or your future?" But Daniel brushed her off, muttering something about not wanting to discuss family politics. Privately, though, her words stuck with him. Especially now that things with Vanessa no longer felt exciting but suffocating. Every time he opened social media, he was tagged in photos of himself and Vanessa at events, pictures he didn't remember agreeing to, captions written like they were a fairy tale power couple. Yet behind closed doors, Vanessa snapped more frequently, accused him of still having feelings for that charity case, and threw shade any time Liam's name accidentally slipped from his lips. His world, once pristine and controlled, was beginning to crack beneath the weight of the lies he helped build. Meanwhile, in the quiet sanctuary of Dorchester, Clarice sat across from Isabella one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the modest living room. Liam lay curled against Isabella's chest, nursing softly, his tiny fingers wrapped around a lock of her hair. Clarice's voice was hesitant but firm. "I know he doesn't deserve it, Izzy. Not after what he's done. But sometimes, people only wake up when they're forced to see the truth in front of them." Isabella looked up, confused. Clarice continued, "He needs to see his son. Not in a courtroom. Not in a headline. But face to face. You've done your part. Let him see what he's denying." Isabella resisted at first, terrified at the thought of more humiliation. But Clarice's logic was steady, wise. Closure doesn't come from waiting. Sometimes, it comes from knowing you tried, even when they didn't. That night, Isabella stared at Liam as he slept in her arms, and a quiet decision took root in her heart. She would go. Not for Daniel. Not to beg. But to give him one last chance to meet the life he tried to erase. The next morning, she packed a small diaper bag, dressed Liam in the soft blue onesie Clarice had hand-stitched, and made her way to Everett Holdings. She didn't know what she would say. She didn't know if he would even care. But she was ready. Not to win him back, but to close the door with dignity. The lobby of Everett Holdings gleamed like a cathedral of capitalism, towering marble pillars, pristine white floors, and glass walls that reflected status more than sunlight. Isabella stood there, small and composed, clutching Liam close to her chest as people in designer suits hurried past her without a glance. She wore a neatly pressed dress, the same navy blue one she'd saved for job interviews, paired with sensible flats. Her hair was pulled into a low bun, her face bare but glowing from her homemade turmeric cream. Liam slept soundly against her, unaware that he was the reason for this difficult pilgrimage. When she approached the receptionist and asked to see Daniel Everett, she was met with hesitation. But after a few moments of quiet stares, hushed whispers, and one long call upstairs, she was told to wait. Eventually, she was led to a private elevator that ascended silently to the executive floor. Her heart thudded with every passing level, not with hope, but with restrained anticipation. This wasn't about changing Daniel's mind. This was about standing in her truth, one last time. When the elevator doors opened, Vanessa was already waiting. She stood like a sentry, arms crossed over a sleek red blazer, lips painted with precision, and a knowing smirk that reeked of premeditated cruelty. "Well, look who dragged herself in," she said, her tone venom wrapped in silk. "You should have sent an email. We're very busy people." Isabella didn't flinch. She stepped out, holding Liam tighter, her eyes steady. "I'm here to see Daniel," she said firmly. Vanessa chuckled and motioned toward the glass office at the end of the hallway. "Be my guest." As Isabella entered, Daniel was seated behind his mahogany desk, fingers tapping on a keyboard. He looked up, surprised, then visibly annoyed. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone clipped. Isabella took a deep breath. "I'm not here to plead. I'm not here to argue. I just thought you should meet your son." She gently turned Liam so Daniel could see his face. The child blinked sleepily, cooing softly. For a fleeting moment, something passed over Daniel's expression, something unreadable. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "And this is supposed to mean what, exactly?" he said, his voice like ice. "I already told you, I'm not interested in this mess." His words sliced into Isabella, but she stood her ground. "He's not a mess. He's your son. He deserves to know who you are, even if you've forgotten who you used to be." Vanessa entered then, walking with the air of a woman who owned the world. She looked at the child, then at Isabella, and laughed, openly, cruelly, without shame. "She's a wrecked, lonely single mother looking for pity," Vanessa said, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "Showing up here like a Lifetime movie. Honestly, it's pathetic." Daniel didn't correct her. Didn't flinch. He simply returned to his screen, typing away as if the mother of his child wasn't standing a few feet away, shattered. Isabella felt the heat rush to her face. Her lips trembled, not with weakness, but rage suppressed for far too long. She turned without another word, Liam still pressed against her, and walked away. The sting of the moment burned through her chest, but it didn't crush her. She didn't cry this time. Instead, she whispered to her son as they stepped back into the elevator, "That was the last time we ever give them a chance to humiliate us." And as the doors slid shut, sealing her off from the heartless people above, Isabella knew she was done with Daniel Everett forever. The final string that tethered her to him had been cut. The wind was unusually warm for a Friday morning as Isabella pushed Liam's stroller along the uneven sidewalk of downtown Boston. The city moved as it always had, indifferent, fast-paced, a blur of strangers with somewhere more important to be. But for Isabella, every footstep felt deliberate, heavy with the finality of her decision. The humiliating encounter at Everett Holdings had been her last straw. She had spent nights since then staring at the ceiling of her mother's guest room, replaying Vanessa's words over and over. "She's a wrecked, lonely single mother looking for pity." But instead of allowing those words to chain her to shame, Isabella had let them become fuel. She had spent too long begging for scraps of love from someone who could barely recognize humanity in a child's face. She wasn't going to be a victim of Daniel's choices any longer. And as she stepped into the corner market to pick up diapers and formula, her eyes landed on a display near the checkout, rows of bright, colorful scratch-off lottery tickets. Something in her paused. Not out of belief, but instinct. She had exactly $2 left in her pocket after groceries. With a deep breath and a little shake of her head at her own foolishness, she picked one and added it to her small purchase. That evening, with Liam asleep on a pillow beside her, Isabella scratched the ticket with the corner of a spoon, expecting nothing. The numbers revealed themselves slowly, a row of zeros, then commas, then more zeros. She blinked. Her heart pounded. She reached for the instructions and checked again. Match 3 and win the amount shown. She matched 3. $1,200,000. Her hands began to tremble. For a moment, she sat completely still, unsure if it was real. Then her breath caught. Her pulse exploded. Her first thought wasn't champagne or shopping or luxury. It was the salon. Clarice's touch. The old salon her mother had built with her bare hands and dreams that had never been fulfilled. The abandoned space was still theirs, locked up, dusty, forgotten but not destroyed. Her second thought was Liam. He could have a future now. Not just survival, but stability. She pressed a hand over her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks as she reached for her phone and called her mother. Clarice answered groggily, but when Isabella told her, "Mom, I just won the lottery," her voice cracked with disbelief. Silence followed, then a whispered, "Baby, what did you say?" And that night, for the first time in nearly a year, laughter returned to their home. Plans began the very next morning. Isabella, fueled by adrenaline and vision, dragged Clarice out of bed, not just to share the news but to bring her back to life. They visited the old salon space on Tremont Street, untouched for nearly a decade. The windows were fogged over, paint peeled from the front sign, and dust lay thick as memories across every surface. Yet beneath the decay was a heartbeat, a history, a chance to rise again. Clarice walked through the space slowly, her fingers trailing along the old reception desk, tears forming in her eyes. "This place was my world once," she whispered. Isabella looked at her, voice steady, "It will be again. But this time, we'll build it together. And better." Within days, contractors were hired, permits pulled, and Isabella began sketching branding ideas on scraps of paper. She wanted more than a salon, she wanted a sanctuary. A place for women like her, women who had been broken, shamed, cast aside, to come and feel beautiful again. She decided on the name, Crown and Grace. Because every woman deserved to wear a crown, even if the world never handed her one. As renovations began and the scent of fresh paint filled the air, Isabella stood in the middle of the empty space, Liam on her hip, and whispered, "This is for you. Everything changes now." And with that promise, her new life began. Not as a wreck, not as a lonely mother, but as a builder of empires. The grand reopening of Crown and Grace was nothing short of miraculous. What once stood as a crumbling shell of faded dreams had been reborn into a radiant sanctuary of warmth and elegance. Sunlight poured through the newly installed floor-to-ceiling windows, dancing across the polished wooden floors and walls adorned with floral murals hand-painted by local artists Isabella hired. The scent of lemongrass, lavender, and honey shea butter filled the air, instantly soothing every client that stepped inside. Clarice, now looking 20 years younger with joy returning to her spirit, greeted women at the door like royalty. And at the heart of it all was Isabella, standing tall in a tailored cream jumpsuit, her hair swept into a crown of curls, Liam strapped to her back, content and smiling. Clients came in waves, many out of curiosity, some from the support group, and others from social media where Isabella had started posting behind-the-scenes photos of their journey to revival. The atmosphere was unlike any salon in the city. It wasn't just about hairstyles and facials. It was about transformation, about healing. And word spread quickly that Crown and Grace was more than a business, it was a movement. The services offered were personal and inspired, natural hair care, holistic facials using Isabella's signature turmeric and clay masks, and therapy-infused beauty talks where women could sit, sip tea, and talk about their scars. Isabella even created glow-up Saturdays for single mothers, offering free pampering to women who simply needed to feel seen. She used the remaining portion of her lottery winnings wisely, investing not just in the salon, but in people. She hired women from the support group, single mothers from shelters, survivors of emotional abuse, giving them skills, jobs, and a place to reclaim their power. Each one had a story, and Isabella knew them all. She didn't just employ, she empowered. And her business reflected that authenticity. Clients began tagging the salon on Instagram and TikTok. Videos of transformations, physical and emotional, went viral. One post of a woman breaking down in tears after seeing her new look reached over 500,000 views in a week. Isabella's follower count soared. She wasn't just the girl who had once been left on the street with a newborn, she was now Boston's most talked about beauty entrepreneur with a purpose that resonated far beyond the salon walls. But her success didn't just draw admiration, it caught the attention of major voices in the beauty industry. A local lifestyle magazine did a feature on her, titling it From Rejected to Radiant, The Rise of Isabella Monroe. The piece went viral, landing her interviews, podcast invitations, and inquiries from potential investors. But Isabella remained grounded. She turned down offers that didn't align with her vision, refusing to sell her formulas or mass-produce her creams just for profit. She knew what made her brand special. It was personal, intentional, and built from pain turned purpose. One afternoon, as she stood in the middle of the salon after closing hours, Liam asleep on her office couch, Clarice by her side steaming towels, Isabella turned to her mother and said, "Can you believe it? This time last year, I was scrubbing marble floors in silence. Now, we've created something people feel in their souls." Clarice smiled, her voice filled with pride. "You didn't just build a salon, baby. You built a throne from the ruins they left you in." And as Isabella dimmed the lights and looked out through the glass doors into the glowing city beyond, she whispered to herself, "I'm just getting started." Isabella hadn't planned for expansion so soon, but when the waiting list at Crown and Grace reached nearly 300 names in just 4 months, she knew the vision had grown larger than its original walls. The calls started coming from other cities, women asking if there were branches in New York, D.C., even as far as Atlanta. But it was the request from Manhattan, just a stone's throw from where Daniel and Vanessa still lived in their glass tower, that gave her pause. She wasn't driven by revenge, but the thought of planting her flag in the same city that once tried to erase her stirred something in her. She visited the city quietly, walking through different neighborhoods, taking notes, visiting local vendors and spaces. And when she stepped into a modest 2-story building in Harlem with vintage charm, original wood molding, and a rooftop that kissed the skyline, she knew it was the one. Her vision was clear. The second branch of Crown and Grace would not only replicate her Boston sanctuary but also reflect the heartbeat of Harlem, bold, artistic, soulful. She signed the lease within a week and returned home with her heart pounding in equal parts fear and faith. To support the expansion, Isabella launched her handcrafted skincare line under the name Grace by Izzy, a nod to the identity she had forged through ashes. The brand wasn't flashy. It was intimate. Organic face butters named after the women in her support group, Angela's Calm, Mara's Glow, Clarice's Strength. Each jar carried a small handwritten quote under its lid, each one crafted by Isabella late at night after putting Liam to sleep. She made her first sales via Instagram, using the same platform that had once hosted gossip and humiliation about her life. Now, it carried her story on its shoulders like a badge of triumph. Orders flooded in, first from local clients, then from strangers across the country. The packaging was elegant and simple, amber glass jars, matte cream labels, and gold-embossed cursive that read, "Made with Grace." To fulfill demand, Isabella hired more women, single mothers, elderly women with years of salon experience but no retirement, and younger girls who had dropped out of school due to life's hard punches. The brand became more than a product, it became a purpose. And as the Harlem branch neared completion, Isabella made a vow: every space she opened would not only be beautiful, but healing. As the business grew, so did her personal life. Melanie returned from her second consulting tour in Canada, excited to finally plant roots. "I told you," she teased as they walked through the near-complete Manhattan location. "I knew you'd end up changing the game." Isabella laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in years. "I just wanted to survive," she replied, "but now I want more." Melanie, with her sharp eye for branding and heart for storytelling, joined the team as head of marketing. Together, they rebranded Isabella's journey, no longer the story of a broken woman rising, but of a warrior woman redefining beauty. The new tagline read, "Beauty Reclaimed. Power Restored." As they launched a pre-opening soft event in Harlem with local influencers and community leaders, Isabella stood in the middle of the new space and watched as women walked in and visibly exhaled, as if they knew, instinctively, they were somewhere safe. Liam, now toddling on unsteady feet, giggled as he chased Melanie's scarf down the hallway. Clarice, her spirit fully restored, taught new hires her massage techniques with pride. And Isabella? She didn't just smile. She stood tall. The woman who was once thrown out with a newborn in her arms now stood at the helm of an empire born from pain, grace, and relentless determination. And she wasn't done, not by a long shot. The glossy surface of Daniel Everett's life began to crack, slowly at first, like hairline fractures in a sheet of glass, then with forceful, shattering blows that even he couldn't deny. It started with whispers around the boardroom table at Everett Holdings, discreet conversations between partners who had once sung his praises. A project in Dubai had gone sideways due to forged documentation, funds wired to ghost accounts. Then came the internal audit, revealing irregularities tied to executive transactions, all traced back to the unmonitored expense accounts Vanessa insisted on managing. Daniel, too caught up in salvaging his public image and appeasing Vanessa's lavish appetite for yachts, jewels, and custom vacations, had allowed her to oversee financial operations she had no qualifications to handle. The company's CFO, a no-nonsense woman named Geraldine Hart, launched a private inquiry. What she uncovered unraveled everything. Vanessa had been siphoning money, cleverly, methodically, using shell companies registered in Daniel's name, ensuring every trail pointed directly to him. Overnight, his emails were frozen. Board members stopped returning his calls. And on a Monday morning that smelled like betrayal and bitter coffee, Daniel was escorted from the building while the media waited outside like vultures in tailored suits. Daniel returned to his penthouse, but even home no longer felt safe. The silence was different now, no longer a choice, but a sentence. Vanessa wasn't there when he got back. Instead, she had left a note scribbled in rushed pen on the marble kitchen counter, "Don't call me. Ever." You knew the game. Alongside it were receipts of luxury items sold for cash, her shoes, her jewelry, the bags she flaunted in his face. Gone too was the Porsche he bought her last winter, replaced in the garage by an oil-stained empty spot. He checked his accounts. Half were frozen, the rest had been drained. Every card declined. Panic set in like a cold sweat. How had he let this happen? In his arrogance, he had assumed Vanessa was a trophy. In reality, she had been playing chess while he played checkers, calculating, maneuvering, stripping him bare piece by piece. He tried to call his mother, Vivian, but even she didn't answer. He wasn't a son anymore, he was an embarrassment. Alone, stripped of fortune, and with the walls of his world closing in, Daniel finally sank into the couch where Isabella once used to leave notes, once used to wait for him with tea and hope. But there was no hope here anymore. Just silence and consequences. That night, Daniel sat in the dim glow of the living room, scrolling through news articles that tore his name to shreds. Headlines like Everett Empire in Trouble and From Powerhouse to Pariah, Daniel Everett's Fall from Grace filled the screen. But what caught his eye most wasn't about him, it was a featured article in a lifestyle blog titled The Woman Who Rebuilt Herself, Crown and Grace's second location opens in Harlem. There she was, Isabella, standing radiant in white, holding Liam, surrounded by women with joy on their faces. Her eyes no longer carried pain, just purpose. Daniel stared at the screen for a long time, jaw clenched, heart burning with a regret he hadn't allowed himself to feel until now. This wasn't just about being robbed. He had given up something irreplaceable. Not just a child, not just a marriage, but a woman who had once loved him purely, unconditionally. He clicked on her profile, finding videos of her giving interviews, laughing, living. She was no longer reachable. Not emotionally, not physically, not socially. She had risen beyond him. And in the cold loneliness of the penthouse he once bragged about, Daniel Everett finally understood the meaning of loss. Real, irreparable, and deserved. His kingdom was falling, and the only thing rising now was karma, swift, cruel, and dressed in the name he never thought he'd whisper again, Isabella Monroe. The Grand Boston Business Honors Gala was the city's most exclusive event, an evening reserved for moguls, entrepreneurs, philanthropists, and elite press. Hosted at the Regal Holloway Hall, it glittered with crystal chandeliers, gold-rimmed champagne glasses, and soft classical music played by a live quartet. Isabella hadn't planned to attend. Her schedule was full with 2 salons to manage, an exploding skincare line, and her commitment to community outreach. But when she was nominated for the Rising Visionary Award of the Year, Melanie insisted. "This is not just about you," she said, helping Isabella choose a dress from a local designer. "This is about every woman who thought she was finished." Isabella walked into that ballroom radiant in a custom emerald silk gown, her curls cascading down her back, and Liam's fingerprint pinned around her neck. She didn't need anyone to tell her she looked powerful, she felt it. Her posture was effortless, her smile gracious, and when the event MC introduced her as a beacon of resilience and grace in the modern business world, the applause that followed wasn't out of politeness, it was reverence. Daniel Everett sat near the back, nursing a glass of untouched champagne he could no longer afford. He hadn't been invited, he got in on a +1 from an old colleague who pitied him. His once recognizable name was now whispered with caution, associated more with scandal than success. When he heard Isabella's name, he flinched. And when she stepped onto the stage, he almost didn't recognize her. The woman he once discarded stood regal under the lights, speaking eloquently about beauty, healing, and creating spaces where women could rise again. Her voice didn't shake. Her eyes didn't search for approval. She wasn't his wife anymore. She wasn't even the woman he left. She was reborn, untouchable, thriving, and so far beyond him that it stung more than any headline ever had. As she left the stage, award in hand, she made her way through the crowd with poise. That's when their eyes met. A brief moment. A breath caught. A flash of recognition and reckoning. He stood up, unsure if his legs would hold, and made his way toward her like a man chasing a memory he never fully understood. "Isabella," he said, his voice lower, hoarser than he remembered it being. She turned slowly, unfazed, eyes calm but unreadable. "I saw your speech," he said, forcing a weak smile. "You were brilliant." She nodded once. "Thank you." An awkward silence hung between them, and then he glanced at the award in her hand. "You've done well," he muttered. "Better than I ever imagined." She tilted her head slightly, her voice steady. "No. I've done better than you ever believed I could." Daniel lowered his eyes, but she wasn't finished. "This," she gestured around her, "was built from pain you thought would break me. You didn't just underestimate me, you dismissed me. And that's the only thing I'll thank you for." He opened his mouth to speak, but she stepped past him with grace that left him frozen. "And Liam," he called after her. She turned back once. "Liam has everything he needs. And more." Then she walked away, the weight of 1,000 apologies she would never hear dissolving in her wake. Daniel stood still, watching her disappear into the sea of admiration and celebration. In that moment, he finally understood what regret felt like, not as an emotion, but as a lifetime sentence. Morning sunlight spilled through the glass panels of Crown and Grace's newest flagship branch, a sprawling, light-filled space nestled between an art gallery and a wellness cafe in downtown Boston. Isabella walked slowly down the polished hallway, admiring the final touches, a soft lilac feature wall with hand-painted crowns, gold-trimmed mirrors, and a reception desk engraved with her favorite mantra, "Grace never begs to be seen, it arrives and changes everything." This was her 4th location in just under 2 years. What had begun as a desperate act of survival had transformed into a revolution of beauty, healing, and empowerment. Isabella stood still for a moment, overcome by the magnitude of how far she'd come. The launch day was set to be a community event, free services for single mothers, food trucks from local women-owned businesses, and a live panel on entrepreneurship. She had invited the women from her original support group and gifted them all positions as senior advisors or partners. Angela, one of the first women she'd met in group therapy, now managed the Boston branch. Mara, once a battered wife with no income, now ran Grace by Izzy's operations. Together, they had built an empire not of status, but of solidarity. Liam, now 3 years old, had grown into a vibrant, confident child with curls that bounced as he ran and laughter that filled entire rooms. Clarice's health had improved steadily. She now taught weekly empowerment classes to women over 50 and held skincare workshops from the salon's wellness wing. Melanie, ever sharp and creative, had just secured a book deal to write about Isabella's story, not as a sob tale, but as a blueprint for rising. The salon's Instagram had passed 2 million followers, and Grace by Izzy was now stocked in boutique stores nationwide. Despite her success, Isabella kept her circle small and her heart grounded. She still walked Liam to daycare herself. Still spent Sunday afternoons making new products in her kitchen. And when clients asked her how she managed to do it all, she would smile and say, "By remembering who I am, even when they tried to make me forget." She didn't mention Daniel, not because the pain had disappeared, but because it no longer controlled her. He had faded into a distant memory, a cautionary tale, not a current wound. Meanwhile, Daniel Everett's world had finally collapsed. His name was officially removed from the Everett Holdings board following a unanimous vote. His assets had been liquidated to pay restitution, and his penthouse sold to cover lawsuits. He lived now in a modest apartment on the city's edge, where the silence of his downfall echoed louder than any public headline. Vanessa had been captured in Mexico after a failed attempt to bribe a customs official with counterfeit documents. She was now facing trial for grand larceny, identity theft, and financial fraud. Her arrest had made national news. But no one sought Daniel for comment anymore. His story had expired, much like his influence. One afternoon, he stood at a pharmacy checkout line and caught sight of a glossy magazine cover that made his chest tighten. Isabella, radiant in white, holding Liam, under the headline "From Abandoned to Icon, How She Reclaimed Her Crown." He picked it up, skimmed the article, and read her quote, "Sometimes, the greatest revenge is simply becoming everything they said you'd never be." Daniel left the magazine on the rack, unable to carry the weight of his own reflection. That evening, he stared at the city skyline, now just lights he had no access to. And for the first time, he whispered into the empty room, "I lost the best thing that ever happened to me." But it was too late. The world had already moved on, and so had she. The early morning air was crisp with the first scent of spring as Isabella unlocked the doors to Crown and Grace's original location on Tremont Street. The sun bathed the storefront in gold, casting long streaks of light across the sidewalk like a divine reminder of all that had been reborn within these walls. Inside, the salon was already humming to life. The soft jazz playlist Clarice loved played faintly through the speakers, freshly brewed hibiscus tea steamed on the reception desk, and framed photos of the salon's journey hung along the wall like pieces of a timeline only Grace could write. Isabella walked slowly through the space, greeting her team, her smile genuine and full. This wasn't just a business, it was her healing, her testimony, her crown rebuilt from the ashes. She paused by the mirror where she once saw herself as a wrecked woman with nothing but pain in her eyes. Now, the reflection stared back with quiet power. She wore no makeup, just a touch of rose oil on her cheeks and the unwavering glow of self-earned peace. She didn't need validation anymore. Not from Daniel, not from society, not even from herself. Her worth was no longer in question, it was carved into every detail of her legacy. Liam, now fully of words and questions, burst into the room moments later wearing his tiny school backpack and carrying a rolled-up drawing in his hand. "Mommy, Mommy, look what I made," he shouted with pure excitement. Isabella scooped him up into her arms and kissed his forehead as he unrolled the paper. It was a colorful crayon sketch, a smiling woman with curly hair and a crown on her head, holding hands with a little boy. Above them, in big wobbly letters, he had written, "You're my hero, Mom." The lump in Isabella's throat formed instantly, but her tears didn't fall out of sorrow, they were sacred, made of joy, pride, and every moment she had fought to arrive at this very point. Clarice peeked from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron, and smiled. "Looks like someone captured the truth," she said, nodding toward the drawing. Isabella placed it in a golden frame and set it on the front desk, where everyone who entered could see what survival looked like when it bloomed into strength. Liam had no idea how much he'd saved her just by existing. And Isabella knew now, she hadn't just survived, she had risen. That afternoon, as the salon buzzed with life, women laughing, children playing in the cozy corner Isabella had designed for single moms, stylists working like artisans, she stepped out onto the front stoop for a moment of stillness. The wind played gently with her curls as she looked up at the sky, the same one she used to whisper prayers under when she felt alone and discarded. Somewhere out there, Daniel probably still lived in the ruins of his former kingdom. But she no longer felt anger, only indifference. He had been a chapter, not her story. And Vanessa? A storm she'd walked through and come out shining. Isabella glanced at the small engraved plaque by the door that read, "To every woman who was once told she wasn't enough, this space is for you." She smiled and stepped back inside, where Liam ran to her, giggling, arms wide. In that moment, Isabella realized the full circle of grace. Not just in her career. Not just in her healing. But in the creation of a life built on faith, love, and relentless self-belief. She bent down, embraced her son, and whispered, "This is only the beginning." And it truly was, a new beginning, born not from pity, but from purpose. From pain, she built power. From rejection, she built an empire. And from ruin, she wore her crown. The end.